Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I want you to imagine that it's just before 5 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. You're about to log off for the weekend, and suddenly your inbox pings. Your CMO is asking what's going on. Your community manager is sharing a screenshot that's already circulating. You rush to check your social accounts, and you see a post from your company's brand account that you've never seen before. Maybe someone's hacked you. Maybe an employee left their laptop open and their Facebook is connected to the brand account. Maybe it's from a former employee who left a few months ago and still has access. What do you do in that situation? That is part of what we're here to talk about today. For a quick intro, I'm Elior. I'm the creative marketing manager at Spikerz. We're a social media security company that protects brands on their social and ad channels. And I will be hosting today's discussion on navigating a social media crisis. Some housekeeping before we get into it. We'll have a couple of polls up during the discussion. So jump in when you see them. We definitely want to hear from you. We want it to be interactive. So you're not just listening to us waffle for 45 minutes. And stick around to the end because we're going to be doing a live Q&A and sharing something that we've built specifically for the people attending here today. So let me introduce the guests who know much more than I do and have seen firsthand what a social media crisis looks like from the inside. And Naveh is the CEO and co-founder of Spikerz, and he spent the last few years helping brands navigate the threats that face them on social media, especially in the world of AI, where attacks are automated, personalized, and even more costly. Naveh, can you give us a 30-second insight into who you are and what you do at Spikerz?
Sure thing. So Spikerz protects brands on social media, many from the stuff that isn't obvious until it's too late. Account takeovers, impersonations, or coordinated attacks in the comment section, basically everything in between. We work across tens of thousands of accounts of all different sizes. So we end up seeing patterns that teams actually never get to see.
Thank you. And Emma, you're joining us from the comms and PR side of this. Can you introduce yourself for us?
Yes. Hi, I'm Emma Streets, and I've been working in PR, comms and social media for 21 years now. I've worked in a mix of in-house agency and consultancy in all sorts of industries, from fashion and beauty through to logistics and technology. And I now specialize in crisis comms and reputation management.
Perfect. So between the two of you, we've got the how it happens side and the what you do when it does happen side, which is exactly why I wanted to bring you both together for this conversation. Naveh, let's start with this. Why is this a bigger problem now than it was even 2 years ago?
So the simple answer is automation, and the favorite word of everybody is AI, right? Attackers used to sit in the computers with their computers at their homes with 10 figures, picking which brand to go after and basically to run a scam. Now, because of the tools and the AI, you are able to scan thousands of accounts at once, looking for the smallest weaknesses or security gaps that you can exploit. So maybe it's an old password that maybe nobody changed for a while, a former employee who still have access to your brand's account, comment section that clearly isn't being moderated. It's not personal, it's just scale. If there's a gap, someone will eventually find it because they have tools to find it.
And how much bigger has this actually gotten in recent years?
So forget the recent years. Let's talk about the past year. So we just saw an IBM report that found that every company in the world experienced at least once a cyber attack, but 25% of them that said that it was AI driven. And this is 56% more than last year. So it's something that we see at different scale. And we see this momentum happening faster and faster because the adoption is honestly something we've never seen before.
And Emma, does that match what you're seeing on your side? Are things scaling up compared to a few years ago because of AI?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's the fact that this can be developed, mass produced and at scale. But I think there's also another confusion really about cyber still. I think even though it makes mainstream media news now, I think a lot of people still think that this cyber attack is associated with big corporates, potentially, banks, big kind of institutions. But actually it can genuinely affect everyone and businesses of all different sizes. It's also making things a lot more difficult to track the visibility of your brand online. I think there are so many different channels now, including social channels. And again, a lot of brands are choosing not to have presence, for example, on X. That doesn't mean that their brand is not being talked about on X, but they're blind to that monitoring. So I think the volume of content as well is making it even more challenging. And that's why planning and stakeholder mapping now is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like both preventing a crisis and actually managing one are getting harder at the same time. So before we get into the specific stories, I actually want to hear from the audience about this. When you think of someone hacking into an account, you probably think of something from the movies like this, a hacker wearing a hoodie, sitting at their computer, typing code, saying things like, we have to shut down the mainframe. We've got 60 seconds until they trace our location. Now I just need to reroute the encryption, whatever that means. But in reality, a lot of the hacks are a lot more boring than that. They often start with an old login that no one ever removed, an agency that still has access, or maybe even an AI agent that got connected once and then forgotten about. So what I want to know is, for the people watching at home, is whether you could list everyone who has login access to your brand's social accounts right now. This includes current employees, past employees, freelancers, agencies, AI agents, anyone who currently uses the account or was previously given access and never removed. Could you list all of them right now? Naveh, how many times have you reviewed a brand security setup and found that they had admins in their account that either shouldn't be there or they didn't even recognize?
So unfortunately, this happens in 100% of the cases. Every time we run an audit for a brand, we always find either people who left the company months ago that just somebody forgot to remove them, or freelancers who did one job on their accounts a year ago and still have access. In all of the cases, these brands don't know that person is a bad thing, right? You don't even know the guy because the company is too big, but also you need to do some digging. And it's scary because it only takes one of these people to accidentally click on a phishing link or have their password leaked on the dark web. And basically the brand is completely vulnerable because of all of these gaps, right?
Yeah, for sure. And do you think that's also reflected in the industry as a whole, beyond just the people that you've run scans for at Spikerz?
Absolutely. Remember the IBM report that I mentioned earlier? So 92% of the people that answered that actually didn't have any access control in place. So if you have a problem and you don't have a solution for, and then comes AI, we saw that having a good identity and access management was one of the single most effective things the company could do to cut down the cost of a breach.
I wanted to look at a real example of neglected access to a social media account for a brand in America that some of you may have heard about, called Disney. Naveh, walk us through the Instagram and Facebook hack against Disney. This is one of the biggest brands on the entire planet. So how does something like this even happen to them?
Right. So this actually happened in October last year. Disney's official Instagram and Facebook got hacked, and whoever behind it started posting about a fake cryptocurrency called Disney Solana. Basically a made-up coin using Disney's name to make it look legitimate. Fans rushed to invest and buy the coin. The coin's value spiked and then completely collapsed in about half an hour. This is what you call a run. The hacker rode to the sunset with a lot of cash in his pockets, straight from Disney fans who trusted the Disney's official page because it was posted on their official account.
This is a company with presumably a very serious security team. So what actually went wrong here?
I think that's the important part. So these incidents always never come down to some brilliant piece of hacking. All that really happens is that somebody somewhere had access they shouldn't have, or a credential that was never rotated or forgotten about. This happened too often, unfortunately. Companies' size doesn't fix it because you don't have the ability to solve it automatically today. And the social platforms are built like Swiss cheese. It's the only thing that can actually solve it is a security process, systems, and monitoring.
Right, which I guess makes the answers to the poll even more important because, for everyone that answered no or not sure, they're at risk of the exact same thing happening to them. I actually want to shift the conversation a bit to a different type of social media crisis. This is one where no one was hacked, no passwords were handed over, and the brand, originally had very little control over how things actually escalated. It's another brand you've probably heard of, unless you've been living under a rock for the past year. Emma, can you set the scene here of how this viral trend started out as something actually quite problematic for Jet2 before it became this huge viral hit for them?
Yeah, so originally the sound was being used as a trending sound on content that showed holiday disasters, so delays, accidents, things happening on holiday that were negative. But actually, this is genuinely such a great response to this sort of issue because Jet2 really leaned into this. And I think it also helps that as a brand, that is very them and it's very true to who they are. And they basically joined in with the trend and then, managed to capitalize on it essentially by commenting commenting on the post, engaging with people who are sharing it. They launched a TikTok challenge. They basically shifted their entire marketing strategy, and it did go global. Across the world, people were singing that song, and their awareness, and I believe subsequently their commercial success since that has seen massive boost. And, it's been really great for them as a brand.
We've seen what happens when someone hacks their way into a brand account. And we've seen what happens when the internet just runs with a story on its own. But there's a third version of this that might actually be the hardest to plan for. Someone who already has legitimate access and decides to use it against the brand. So here are some examples where, disgruntled employees that have legitimate access to the account have basically used it for evil. Naveh, can you walk me through what happened with this middle one?
Yep. So this one is a nonprofit in New Jersey called Downtown Summit. They fired their part-time social media manager, but nobody actually revoked his access to the TikTok account. So he just kept posting. He actually opened one of the videos with this, like, they fired me as their social media manager, but I'm still logged into their TikTok account. Then spent a few more days basically trashing his old bosses and the local businesses he used to work and
Emma, what about this HMV story on the right? What happened here?
This was just a really classic example. I think it was a long time ago now, where employees were basically live tweeting them being, laid off and made redundant. And I think basically, this has now become a bit of a cultural cliche. I think people are very aware of this now as a risk. However, and that story in particular made global news within a day. But 13 years later, this is still a massive issue for people. And I think it's very trickier than the other examples we've mentioned, perhaps, because it's an issue to do with company culture, and it's not something that is a quick fix. It's being close enough to your team and understanding that the vibe within the camp. But also, I think certain other newer trends have kind of made this more of a risk. For example, a lot of companies now have leaned into employees being brand ambassadors, and they really encourage their teams to be, posting on social media and almost incentivizing this to do that, to help build the brand reputation. But the issue with that is that's great when it's all positive, right? But if you've encouraged your people to be constantly sharing their work life on social media, then that comes with the flip side of that is a risk that you take when you promote that strategy. So again, you can't just turn something like that on and off whenever it suits you as a brand. And again, people expect this transparency now with company culture as well. So this is why it's a long game in terms of strategy around this. And it's why you have to prioritize your internal comms and your people, because this is what can happen basically if you don't.
Yeah, 100%. You made a great point. I've seen a lot of people talking about how, people are moving away from user-generated content and brand-generated content and are really leaning into employee-generated content, encouraging their employees to be those brand ambassadors, talking about the brand. And, like you said, that also comes with that risk that, if they have that big platform and they're being linked to the brand, they could potentially use that in a way that the company didn't intend. Naveh, I just wanted to, before we moved on from this one, talk about this New York Post example on the left side. Can you tell me about that and what happened?
Yeah, so in the New York Post example, someone with legitimate access to the verified account just posted a bunch of fake hate headlines made to look like real news. It wasn't a hack. Whoever did it already had the keys, which is exactly what makes this threat so hard to catch from a security standpoint. The login is real, the access is real, so no one sees it until, unfortunately, it's too late when you decide to do something back.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, in all of these, someone, like you said, Naveh, already had the keys to the brand. What about the opposite problem when someone who's never had any legitimate access at all, but is pretending they do? I'm talking about brand impersonation. This happens to brands, it happens to celebrities, it happens to public figures. Naveh, from security side, what can you tell me about the threat of impersonators on social media?
So impersonation has its own huge category. We see impersonators popping up constantly among our clients, especially around customer service or household names. A classic one, for example, is airlines. Someone posts a genuine complaint or question under an airline's post, and within minutes, even in some cases seconds, a fake account that looks exactly like airline's support team replies, asking them to move their conversation to the DMs or hand over the booking details or even credit card details. It looks completely legitimate at a glance, right logo, right tone, right name, but of course it's a complete scam engineered to fool people and steal the money.
Yeah, of course. I imagine going back to what we were talking about before, AI has made it a lot easier for people to, scale this kind of scam, make impersonation more believable, whether it's through deep fakes or emails or whatever it is. We used to get these emails from Nigerian princes, all these spelling mistakes, and it's obvious to spot. And, now with AI, you can run a few prompts and can automate that.
Yeah, it's become a lot harder to, as a human being, to see that, understand, and try to avoid it. Again, you said it right. When you have a misspell, okay, you can get it, but what happens if it's flawless, right? And you get 50 of them a day, right? It's just in a different scale.
For sure. And how common actually is this?
So a lot more than people realize. So the FTC put out number this year showing people losing, $3.5 billion to impersonation scams just last year. So just to get the perspective, in 2020, it was $1 billion. So we're talking about 3.5x in just 5 years. So it's incredible growth in a bad way, unfortunately, but it is an incredible growth.
Yeah. And Emma, have you seen this kind of impersonation happening too? How does it show up on either your feed or, for your clients you're working with?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, personally, I saw my first piece of deepfake content back in 2017. Now, that was totally different. And that was against a CEO of a large company. But again, the scale that we're seeing now is different. I think it does still tend to be leadership roles and CEOs and public figures that are targeted, but we're also more aware of it as a society. So even, for example, in the World Cup, I think Thierry Henry spoke up about a video that was going viral about him. And he just made some really clear points around, look, it's 2026. Don't trust everything that you see online. Question your sources. And I think this is the point of using critical thinking. Whilst deepfakes have now got so sophisticated, in the first instance, don't share, stop before you're sharing content online, question where it's come from. But then saying that, I think even within the quality of deepfake content that we're seeing now, there are some tells still, things to look out for example, specific features like people's hands, when they move their face, side of faces are still quite hard to replicate. Lip syncing, so the audio soundtrack can sometimes be a giveaway if something is a deep fake. But I think it's really difficult. There's no tool or person that can 100% detect this content. So you have to rely on a bit of a combination of the two.
What I want to spend a bit of time on now is what actually goes on within a company that contributes to a crisis escalating or going undetected. Because, we've seen and we've spoken about some examples of how external forces are involved, but how about what actually goes on inside the brand before the crisis? Emma, you've been in the room with a lot of brands working on their crisis plan. What's the thing they're usually missing?
I think the first thing to say is that people still get confusion about the definition of a crisis. So a crisis to you might be different to a crisis to me. But I think when we're looking at this from a comms perspective, most comms people will talk about crisis versus issues. A genuine crisis is typically reserved for things like, acts of God, fires, fatal accidents, things that people could not have predicted, those sorts of natural disasters. But actually, in the context of this is where the definition and having the planning in advance comes in helpful, because you have to figure out essentially what does a crisis mean to that business, and what does that look like, and what is an issue, because most issues are long running problems within a business that people will be aware of, but they haven't necessarily stepped far back enough to see that one day that could turn into a crisis. So essentially, a lot of the risks are often hiding in plain sight, and it's often more straightforward than you would imagine. It's often quite simple things that could be obvious to an outsider, but when you're within that company, it's not obvious to you because you're living and breathing that business every single day. I'd also say, in terms of what I mentioned before, really, in terms of internal comms and people, that's always the missing jigsaw piece. I think people can be really quick to emphasize external comms and think, okay, what are we going to say on social media? What are we going to say to the press? When actually what you're going to say to people, because they're the people that are going to ultimately potentially leak, as we've seen, leak information externally anyway. So it's really prioritizing that internal audience as much as you're looking outside of your business. And then one of the other points I'd say as well is that people aren't updating plans frequently enough now. I have conversations where people say, we have a crisis plan, we did it in 2021. Okay. I mean, at this point, we're literally needing to review risks on a 6-monthly basis, at least every 12 months, because the world is changing, particularly online, with the amount of tech, and the evolution of that tech is just speeding up. So I would say that there's some key points. I could go on, but I know we've got a time limit.
No, it's all good. Yeah, we'd love to hear more about what kind of risks have you seen emerging in the last sort of couple of years that make, obviously we've spoken about AI. Is there anything else that's kind of changed that means that, plans that were written back a few years ago might kind of be obsolete by this point?
I think even going down to, I know I said about not focusing on media, but even going down to how the media works and where journalists get their stories from and, just the role of social media, I think is so critical to that process. And I also think the role of comms as well is a whole business responsibility. It shouldn't just come down to one team. When something bad happens, you really have to be prepared with input from the entire business. And often it's the frontline teams, yes, operations, but also your customer service and your social media teams, the front line of your brand. And they're the people that are really central to planning within a crisis, but also being able to respond. And they have the intel and they're seeing on a daily basis the type of content that could put your brand at risk.
Yeah, 100%. And, one of the things I've discussed with Naveh in the past is, this idea of the lack of ownership where, there's lots of different teams that are involved in some way with crisis management, but no one actually knows who's responsible for what, who's responsible for taking down any harmful, toxic comments, who's responsible for dealing with, if someone falls for a phishing link or if a brand gets hacked. Marketing often thinks it's with security often thinks it's with marketing. Naveh, from your side, does that match what you see with the actual brands that you speak to?
Yeah, so it's almost exactly. We see the same gap. Nobody actually assigned to own, for example, the access problem, right? Who have access into what, or who's responsible for locking down an account when something goes wrong, and so on. So on. They don't have a plan. They don't really know who is in charge of what, and they ignore it until something forces them to take control over that. Usually, after it's too late. There's a real problem around ownership when it comes down to preparing and handling crisis, and we definitely need to push harder on brands to do it before the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. So, let's answer the big question then. What can the people watching today actually do about all of this? It's very clear that this is a huge problem. It's bigger than it's ever been. It's happening to all sorts of brands. Luckily, we've got right here the great minds of Naveh, of Emma, some of the leading experts in crisis management. And we've put together actually a playbook for brands that explains exactly how to prepare and how to navigate a crisis when it happens. Emma, I want to start with you. If someone's watching and has genuinely nothing in place right now for how to deal with a crisis, where do they actually start?
So the first place, really simplistically, is just understanding your risks and just getting that list written down securely. Because I think until you do that process and start somewhere with a risk, I think it's quite easy to then see and get momentum about where some of the potential risks could lie. So there's the obvious ones, like we've talked about cyber AI, but then, there's risks of individuals being compromised, external, as I said. So when you're writing this list, think about the conversations that are happening in the world, in your part of the world, in your industry. You have to take an external perspective. You need to view your business as an outsider looking in, not as an insider looking out. And again, that's quite difficult to do, but it's also incredibly refreshing when you do that, because if you can try and see your business with brand new eyes, you have different perspectives on the way that some of your internal processes might be run, for example, the way that you communicate certain things. I think there's a lot of pressure on brands to be very reactionary and jump on trends and things like that. I think, again, that is all a risk in itself if you've not considered how does that fit with your brand. So it's the small things, basically. Start small, I would say, because it can get overwhelming quite quickly if you don't do that. And the other key point is, stakeholder mapping, which just used to be part of a strategy document, I think, in comms back in the day. You'd write a strategy and you'd do a stakeholder map, and then everyone would forget about it and never look at it again. And I think, as we've mentioned already, keeping that sort of thing up to date. Your stakeholders are probably changing all of the time. Include social media in that, include AI in that. You have to be looking at what is the role that those channels are going to play in an incident that's going to affect your brand, and how can you be more aware of what's happening and get more visibility across those platforms. And then lastly, I'd say people, I think simulations get a bad rep. I think back in the day, a lot of people, invested in huge crisis simulations, and I remember certainly being involved in them, and you'd get actors in and people ringing up pretending to be journalists. It doesn't have to be like that now. AI can be used in these scenarios to create quite effective, realistic scenarios, securely, of course, that allow you to just think through one issue. So just pick a risk and just test it, stress test it. Just say, okay, if we were hacked tomorrow, who was the first person that I would contact? What would I do? And just putting yourself in that position and running that experience will really help you to get in the mindset of this is what we actually do need, and not see it as a huge investment and waste of time. It doesn't have to be. It can be very practical.
Yeah, no, of course. AI can be, we've talked about it, how it can be a threat. It can also be a great tool in helping to run some of these simulations to make these processes more efficient. Yeah, it also sounds like from what you're saying that, having actual visibility of those risks and seeing, what the threats are and what your current security situation is, the first step really, and something that people should do before anything else to make sure that they're ready for these crises.
Yeah, I think people are scared of it. I think it's quite intimidating for people. But I can tell you what's scarier is not doing it and trying to do it in the moment when something live is actually happening. That's a much more intimidating place to be. So, yeah, it's really about running through the worst case scenarios when you're in the place of relative calm.
Yeah, great. And Naveh, what about you? Have you got anything to add to that from the security side?
Yeah, so from our side, from the security side of things, honestly, it's a short list, right? So this is like the first step I would do. One is to know exactly who have access and try to audit it regularly as much as possible. Centralize all the passwords and login codes. Do not put that into a spreadsheet and put that in a password manager and make sure it's not on somebody's phone. Don't forget to rotate passwords, because a lot of companies do forget that, and do that on a scheduled basis, meaning make sure you have like a timer every 6 months. We usually recommend doing it 6 months, and make sure you're up to date with this and try to be on top of that. What I mean by that, it doesn't have to be somebody's full-time job, but if something happens, there is a spike, there's a weird activity happening, be mindful and be vigilant about it. Don't wait for the other guy to act. Be there to make sure it's contained.
Yeah, that's some really great advice. Before we move on, there's one thing I would actually love to know from the audience. I know I've been asking you guys a lot, but this will be the last one, I promise. I want to know what your current social media crisis plan actually looks like. Do you have a plan at all? If you do have a plan, does it exist in your mind, or is it something documented both online and offline if there's any problems? Does it cover things like social media hacks, toxic comments, impersonators scamming your customers? Does it factor in stakeholders like Emma mentioned, like social media or AI threats, new social platforms and their regulations? Or, as Emma said, are you still relying on an outdated plan written in 2021 that is no longer relevant? Just before I do open up the floor for the Q&A, Naveh, Spikerz has run crisis readiness checks for, some of the biggest brands out there. And you've very generously opened up a few free slots for attendees of today's webinar. Can you tell me about how a Spikerz crisis readiness check works, what it is, what it includes, and why people should grab one of those slots while they can?
Yeah, so Spikerz can run a crisis readiness. What it means is, I think about it as like gap analysis or risk analysis, right? We do this for brands before they commit working with us, because, we want to uncover the blind spot, seeing exactly what's vulnerable and what we should focus on to make sure your accounts are safe, and help you build an actual plan, monitor it, and execute upon it, not just put it in a drawer and forget about it. The Playbook is a fantastic place to start, but getting the visibility into your brand's account and the specific risk associated with it is important, and it puts you in a different place. And this is something we can do with a quick call with our team and set it up. And we agreed to do that for a specific amount today to make sure whoever joins this webinar have a good indication of his brand's current situation. We've run this for thousands of brands already, right? And the great thing is that it gives you a full map of what to do next, even if you're not working with us, right? We want to make sure to give you the tools to be able to even do it yourself.
I'm going to have a look at the questions that we're getting so far. Emma, I think you've already touched on this, so I'll hand it over to Naveh, and then if you've got anything specific you want to add, then feel free. Naveh, how do you decide what counts as a social media crisis versus just regular feedback, normal negative feedback? This person saying they get angry comments a lot and they don't always know where the line is.
So I think the line crosses when you see a big momentum, right? If it's just one as a negative comment, fine, probably nobody cares, right? But if you see them starting to pile up in a short period of time, so think about it as like a graph. If it just starts to spike, then you need to take more control over it. Don't get into a point that you're seeing this saying, nah, it's too small. If there's a doubt, right, start communicating with your team. And I think one of the most important part is once you have a bigger team that is not aware of it, you pushing it forward to the team can get into a quicker decision for the better or the worse, right? In some cases, you want to maybe contain it even though it just starts the spike. Maybe you're doing it a little bit too late, but still in a position to stop it, right? So don't be the person seeing it as I don't want to raise this into the group. I think this is the biggest problem. People are afraid sometimes to raise problems, but the problem is already happening. It's not you causing the problem. So you actually will be the hero if you spotted it. So this is why we usually put a spotlight on that rather than you're becoming the bad guy.
Yeah. And Emma, was there anything specific you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I'd say, that's kind of reacting to something, but you can still be proactive with that. So if you've already got agreed in advance, essentially a matrix of these are the triggers, what are the criteria, as well as the momentum and the volume, but what is the topic, what are the keywords being used, and what is the process? Because I think if you have a process, then again, that takes away the fear of that individual that's flagging that, because it's not about you. You're just putting this through the process that's already been documented and agreed and approved by the team and the decision makers. And I think that's really important, because I think in the heat of the moment, feeling like it's just you making the decisions as a social media manager under a massive spotlight is a huge amount of pressure for an individual. And that is not, that's not a great environment to be making decisions in. And you don't have to do that, because if you can plan it in advance, at least you have a framework within which to act and respond.
I agree, by the way, 100%. And in the policies that we help companies build, it's exactly what we do. But I want to raise a very unique case that we encountered. We were working with one of the biggest bands in the world, band meaning playing on stages. And they had a very big problem with specific country, with specific language. Okay, so they said something on stage that they shouldn't have, and a lot of specific language messaging came in. Now, you as a person just getting 1,000 comments by bots with specific language you don't speak, nobody could have planned it. And it was all about recipes. And it's not a food company. Okay. It's very random. But then you would say, okay, what's the problem, right? It's not negative. Nobody came in. Nobody defrauded anybody. The only problem is they hijacked the topic. So nobody spoke about the music. Nobody spoke about how great a concert is. Everybody spoke about recipes. Now, if you're a fan and you go to the comment section, everything was about recipes, and they started liking each other, all of those bots. And it's basically top comments is all about that. So I couldn't have imagined to protect myself against that, right? So the reality is a lot stronger than our imagination. But what I'm trying to emphasize is it's going to come something that you should plan, of course, but there's going to be a lot of things that you haven't. So it has to put you in a spot where you need to be vigilant about it. Does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Expect the unexpected when it comes to social media.
I've got another question here that, again, Naveh, might be more angled to you, but Emma would love to hear your thoughts on this as well. So this is someone that audited the company's social media presence when they started and saw that the entire external comms team had access to one of the social channels. They've removed it, but now the team are lobbying the boss to get access. So this person's tried to advise that an extra 4 people having access will increase the attack surface, but they don't seem to be getting through to anyone. Is there a way that you'd recommend positioning this risk of what actually is the issue with having more people with access to the social account?
Yeah, so it really depends on the platform themselves, right? So there are platforms that are a lot better in regards to security, and there are some that are less. Without getting into the very specifics of how it works, in some of them, you can give them access through a partner access and not through directly to your own account. So they have access to theirs and they have access to you. So it's a little bit complicated, so we don't get into that. But generally speaking, cybersecurity is like a chain. It's only as strong as its weakest link. When you have more links in the chain, there's more places to break. The recommendation in general is to have as least as possible. Now, the question is, can you take them out or some of them without interfering the day-to-day? If not, then put the minimum that you have to. And as long as you put the minimum with what you call least privilege access, meaning you give them the minimum type of access you can. So you don't give them admin access to your stuff, right? So if you're going by this route, meaning minimum type of actions, minimum type of access, and minimum type of people, you'll be in the best position to, one, not hurt the company's progress, the business itself, the marketing communications or the marketing efforts, but in the same time, you're not risking the company into a stake that you didn't plan for. Of course, as long as you add people, there are risks. However, they are minimal in this case. And of course, when you give people access, especially in platform that you give access through their personal accounts, make sure their personal accounts are safe as well. How do you do that? You mandate them changing password every 6 months, making sure they're using two-factor authentication. You're making sure they're not logging in from their phone when they're on vacation somewhere. They're making sure their device is not bring your own device, right? You use corporate devices, etc., etc. But you can see all of that in our security playbook. What I'm trying to emphasize is, if you go by the route of security while not hurting the company or the business itself, then there are ways to do it in a less riskier way.
Got you. And Emma, have you ever kind of worked with clients or seen from your own experience, people where, a bunch of people have access to an Instagram, a Facebook account, whatever it is, through their personal accounts, and it potentially exposes them to risks?
Yeah, definitely. And I think with that question, what that highlights for me, I don't know what team that person is in that sent that question, but I'm guessing if they're not in the comms team and they're in potentially the IT team or the ops team, because again, that just reflects back something that I've already mentioned, which is who's responsible for what and how are teams communicating internally within a business, because essentially they've all got the same goal of protecting and building that company's reputation. But it sounds like you've then got two departments at cross purposes when it comes to social media. So again, I think it is a massive challenge, particularly in a big business. I think it can be really difficult to have that conversation, but it does come down to collaboration and figuring out, look, how can we better work together to ensure that the right people have access and that the security is taken care of, but it's not holding people back from feeling that they have access when they're working in the comms team. I think it's really tricky, but you've got to have that internal conversation.
Yeah, 100%. Right. We've got a few more questions coming in, which is really great. We're going to try and get through as many as possible. Emma, from your side, this one is probably more aimed at you. So this is from Sophie Gilbert, who says, from a PR perspective, how do you approach a statement for media about a viral video about your brand that's falsifying information?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because I think originally the advice has always been, if you have a certain format, then respond in the same format. So it would be like, again, a video to counter the viral video. I think in terms of media, obviously they're constantly using social media as a source anyway. So I think it's safe to say that whatever you put out on social media, and this is another risk, can be taken as a press statement. So again, that's why it's really important to think through response strategy in advance and have, potential wording prepared, or be open to different formats, because I think ideally video is responded to with video. I think the argument against that also then is if people want to look to protect the senior team a bit more and just give, the traditional kind of statement response that's not in a video format. But I think increasingly there's an expectation from media that they will be able to have video statements, and that social media will be the channel for them to access that. So hopefully that goes some way to answering the question. But I think, again, it just comes back to what is your brand going to be comfortable with, and pre-planning that scenario so that you're not just hitting someone up and saying, oh, can you just come and do a quick video for me? By the way, it's for, the BBC in the middle of a live issue, and no one's going to want to do that, and you're not going to be a popular person. So yeah, it's a case by case.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Hopefully, Sophie, that answered your question. A bit of a more technical one now. So the company this person works for provides access to a password manager, but they don't allow them to share their social media logins from that manager. What is the next best way to share social passwords with the team?
The entire purpose of using password manager is to be able to share that with people that need access to the password manager. If you're using a password manager and then you're taking the password out of it and sending to whoever, then what's the use of the password manager, right? So this is like a weird one, but you basically nullified the use of the password manager. Two ways to go around it. One, you either make sure you give access, maybe you can give it also a restricted access, maybe 7 days, 10 days, 14 days, whatever, only specific people. And then it's a lot easier. There are some ways to use, for example, like in Spikerz, we have a vault, right? It's like a password manager. And we have what you call sensors, like a Chrome extension that autofills it. Or you have an app on your phone that autofills the password, so you're not physically sharing the password. You're sharing an app that connects you directly to the socials. And this is basically the best way And if they're not allowing to share not that and not that, you're basically in a bad spot because it means you do need to share the password as long as they actually need to log in, right? They need a way to log in.
Yeah. And Emma, is there any way that it's worked particularly well for you in general with clients that you've worked with in terms of sharing passwords in a way that is secure?
Honestly, not really. I think it just seems to be a perennial issue for people. And I think it's obviously harder the more social channels that you're on and the more passwords that you have. But again, I think this is something that is a massive risk for companies of all sizes. This is what we're talking about when we're saying it's not just massive, big businesses. If you're a small startup and you're on like 3 or 4 different social channels, that in itself is enough of a risk if you've got, even within a small team, of knowing who has got where, who's got what where and having that visibility. I think everyone is still trying to figure it out, but it needs to become a priority.
And also, one of the things we continuously see in Memo, you've probably seen it a million times. The guy that owns the 2-factor authentication, right? It's on your phone, you're on vacation, then he started asking you over SMS, hey, Josh, can you send me the 6-digit code? And like, yeah, and you start sending it to people, and you're like, oh, you didn't pay enough attention. You sent it to the wrong person. He's not longer working for the company, but the phone number associated with the Instagram account is his. And you're need to run after this Josh guy a year after he's gone, etc., etc. It's not only passwords, but it's just one side of that. But it's basically anything to do with the account. Something that needs to be monitored and get the better visibility for.
Yeah. And on that topic of kind of, prioritizing social media protection, we've got another question here, and someone is asking how much brands are willing to invest in proactively protecting their social media channels. So is this something that's typically funded from the cybersecurity budget? Should it come from the marketing budget? Should it be a combination of both? This is an interesting one. We've already spoken about, who should own it and which team should be involved. But what about from the budgetary side? Like what percentage of, the marketing budget or the security budget should realistically be allocated to protecting social media accounts, and who should own these purchasing decisions?
My experience is that generally IT and security have a larger budget than marketing and comms. But maybe that has just been, in the past years, I think that was kind of the case. And certainly for some of the companies that I work with, they had, huge tech budgets. And then in comparison, the comms budget is not so small. But I think it's got to be a shared responsibility. And I think it's almost like the conversation then becomes, is the responsibility all about who owns the budget, right? Because then is that a fair way to look at something like this? Because it's obviously going to compromise the entire company and it's going to affect every department. But Naveh, you probably have a more specific answer.
Yeah, so it actually depends on the type of a company, right? Let's take it as a scale, right? One side of that is how consumer facing are you? Right. And the other side is like how not consumer. So as long as you're more inclined to the consumer facing one, it means marketing and comms are more important for you. So for example, publicly traded companies, right? If something happens, your stock can get butchered, etc. But also if you're Disney, right, and people look at you and say, it's a household name, therefore you need to be more inclined to that. Now, regards to security versus marketing, again, it depends. Some cases we see 100% budget ownership takes the security. In some cases, it starts with marketing. They cover up for 6 months until, the security teams can get a budget and then they take over and so on and so on. But in a lot of the cases, I actually agree with you, Emma. It's a shared responsibility when some of it's being taken for marketing because, for marketing, which are not thinking about security every day, it's some kind of an insurance, right? You have KPIs, right? You need to do X, Y, and Z. If you don't have the account, something happens, they'll come at you. That's your job at risk. Therefore, they put some kind of an insurance concept into play where they invest into this saying, okay, I want to make sure I can get to my goals. So it's all, but of course, cybersecurity team as a whole needs to be on top of this and paying for this because it's theirs, basically.
I think that whole topic is just really interesting, and that opens the door to the question about the commercial value of a brand and reputation, and the fact that, again, with all these risks increasing, businesses are now realizing that actually your reputation has a financial impact and a monetary value. And that's something that I think was a much more difficult conversation even 10 years ago.
For sure, because we've seen examples where sometimes, brands are hacked and people use that to scam their customers. Sometimes people hack an account and then are trying to get ransom from the brand itself. So, a hack can have, or whether even a hack or an impersonation or whatever it is, can have massive financial consequences. And like you said, it's a bit of an insurance policy, like, do you want to wait until it's too late and there's potentially millions in damages, or do you want to, invest in something now that's going to actually help you track those risks and eliminate them before they actually ruin your brand's reputation.
And also we've seen some lawsuits as well. So if, for example, your official accounts get hacked and through you they scam people, then if you didn't protect yourself, you're actually responsible for that. So this is what you call negligence. So we saw active lawsuits against companies that didn't protect yourself. It's like, let's call it real estate, right? If you walk into somebody's real estate, something falls on you, and you were negligent. Let's say there's a big tree that you didn't cut down, right? But you should have. And if it hurt somebody, they can actually sue you for that, right? So we see that unfortunately happening more and more often. So it's not only about reputation, actually there's a monetary risk happening.
Right. If we've got time for one more quick question. So someone has said, as a smaller brand, is any of this actually relevant to them, or is this mostly only for big companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we have kind of made reference to this. From my perspective, I think it's certainly relevant to every brand, because actually you could argue that, whilst the monetary value of your business, if it's still growing, is relatively small compared to a massive corporate global company, surely the impact that would have on you as a founder and as a startup would still have a huge impact if your brand was hacked, because that's your livelihood. So I think it's massively relevant. And I think this is where smaller brands and businesses are becoming more of a target, because I think, the hackers are aware that, the global corporates have big teams. Yes, they're still targets anyway, but I think then they're looking at other types of sectors and smaller brands and certain industries. For example, education is one of the most at-risk sectors, which is obviously horrendous to think about why that is the case. But, it's definitely not limited to the big industries and the big companies that we would have thought it was previously. Everyone is a target now.
Yeah, absolutely. With that, I just want to thank everyone that was watching at home. Thank you for both the guests for being here. I would highly recommend get your security system checked, make sure that, you're ready for a crisis. And if not, figure out what those gaps are that you need to fill. See you soon.